What happened in the hills of Montana that day would challenge everything people thought they knew about compassion, mystery, and the lengths one man would go to save the forgotten. This is not just a story about horses. This is about a secret that changed an entire community forever. On a bitter cold morning in November 2019, the livestock auction house in Billings, Montana, buzzed with its usual energy. Ranchers, dealers, and curious onlookers gathered around the makeshift arena where horses were being sold off one by one. But something was different that day. Among the healthy quarter horses and sturdy work animals, there was a separate pen, filled with what the auctioneers quietly called the unfortunates, a collection of sick, injured, and aging horses that most people wouldn't even look at twice. These were the horses destined for slaughterhouses, the ones whose best days were behind them. Horses with clouded eyes from cataracts, others limping from old injuries, some so thin their ribs showed through patchy coats. The regular bidders knew to avoid this particular lot. It was expensive to care for sick animals, and there was no profit to be made from horses that couldn't work. But Thomas Mitchell wasn't a regular bidder. The 62-year-old man stood quietly at the back of the crowd, his weathered hands folded across his chest, studying each animal with an intensity that made others uncomfortable. Thomas had been coming to these auctions for months, but he'd never bid on anything. People started to notice him, this tall, lean man with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes who always wore the same faded denim jacket and seemed to be waiting for something. When the auctioneer called for bids on the first sick horse, an old mare with a severe limp, Thomas raised his hand. The bid was modest, only $300, but it was more than anyone expected for an animal that couldn't even walk properly. He won the bid easily. Then he bid on the next horse, and the next. One by one, Thomas Mitchell purchased every single sick and injured horse in that pen. By the end of the morning, he had spent nearly $15,000 on 23 horses that most people considered worthless. The other bidders watched in amazement and confusion. Some whispered that he must be running some kind of scam, maybe planning to resell the horses for meat in Mexico where regulations were different. Others thought he might be mentally ill, throwing away his life savings on animals that would probably die. Within months, Thomas arranged for the horses to be transported to his property immediately. He owned a modest ranch about 40 miles northeast of Billings, up in the Pryor Mountains where the landscape was rugged and isolated. Neighbors in the area had seen his truck coming and going over the years, but nobody really knew much about Thomas Mitchell. He kept to himself, paid his bills on time, and never caused any trouble. The kind of man who preferred the company of animals to people, they assumed. The horse transport trucks rumbled up the winding dirt road to Thomas's ranch late that afternoon. Local veterinarian Dr. Sarah Chen had been called to meet them there. Thomas had insisted on having medical examinations for all the animals immediately upon arrival. Dr. Chen had never met Thomas before, but she was impressed by his preparation. He had already converted his old barn into a proper medical facility with heated stalls, proper ventilation, and even basic surgical equipment. As Dr. Chen examined each horse, Thomas stood nearby taking detailed notes. He asked informed questions about treatments, medication schedules, and long-term prognosis. This wasn't the behavior of someone who planned to flip the animals for quick profit. Dr. Chen found herself staying later than planned, drawn into conversations about equine rehabilitation techniques and alternative treatments for chronic conditions. Over the following weeks, something remarkable began to happen on Thomas Mitchell's ranch. The sick horses started getting better. Not all of them. Some were too far gone to save, but many began to show signs of improvement under Thomas's careful attention. He was at the barn before sunrise every morning, administering medications, changing bandages, and spending hours with each animal. Neighbors occasionally spotted him walking the property with horses that were strong enough for light exercise. But Thomas Mitchell was a puzzle that nobody in the area could quite solve. He had no family that anyone knew of, no close friends, and no obvious source of income beyond a modest military pension. Yet he continued to spend thousands of dollars on veterinary care, specialized feed, and equipment for his growing herd of rescued horses. Dr. Chen visited regularly and was amazed by the progress many of the animals were making, but Thomas himself remained distant and mysterious. 3 months after that auction, Thomas Mitchell walked into his barn to feed the horses one morning and never came back out. What authorities found when they searched his property would reveal a truth so extraordinary that it would make national news and change how people thought about heroism forever. On February 14, 2020, Dr. Chen arrived at the ranch for a scheduled checkup and found Thomas's truck in the driveway, but no sign of Thomas himself. The barn doors were open, and the horses were clearly agitated. They hadn't been fed that morning. Dr. Chen called Thomas's cell phone repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail. After waiting for 2 hours, she called the Yellowstone County Sheriff's Department. Deputy Marcus Rodriguez arrived at the ranch that afternoon and immediately noticed something odd. Thomas's personal belongings were all still in the house: wallet, keys, medication, even a cup of coffee that was still warm. But there was no sign of struggle, no indication of foul play. It was as if Thomas had simply vanished into thin air. While doing his morning chores, the search effort began immediately. Volunteers from surrounding counties joined law enforcement officials in combing the Pryor Mountains. They searched on foot, on horseback, and with helicopters. The terrain was challenging: rocky outcroppings, dense forests, and hidden canyons, where a person could easily become lost or injured. But after 5 days of intensive searching, they found no trace of Thomas Mitchell. As the search continued, investigators began to examine Thomas's background more carefully. What they discovered was shocking. Military records showed that Thomas Mitchell had been declared dead in Afghanistan in 2004. According to official documents, Sergeant Thomas Mitchell had been killed in an IED explosion outside Kabul, and his family had been notified of his death 16 years earlier. But the man who had been living in Montana, buying sick horses and nursing them back to health, had Thomas Mitchell's fingerprints, Thomas Mitchell's DNA, and Thomas Mitchell's memories. When investigators contacted his supposed widow in North Carolina, she broke down in tears. She had remarried years ago, believing her husband was dead. She had mourned him, buried an empty coffin, and moved on with her life. The truth, as it slowly emerged through military investigations, was both heartbreaking and extraordinary. Thomas Mitchell had not died in Afghanistan. He had been severely injured and suffered complete memory loss. For months, he had been listed as a John Doe in a military hospital in Germany, unable to remember his name, his family, or his past. When his memories finally began to return in fragments, Thomas learned that his family had already been told he was dead and had held a funeral service. Faced with the choice of disrupting their grieving process and returning to a life he could barely remember, Thomas had made an impossible decision. He chose to remain officially dead, to let his family continue their healing process, and to start over with a new identity. Using skills he had learned in military intelligence, Thomas had created a new life for himself in Montana, living quietly off his military benefits under an assumed name. For 15 years, Thomas had carried the weight of this secret alone. He had no contact with his former family, no friends who knew his real story, no one to share the burden of his sacrifice. The horses had become his purpose, his way of channeling the love and care he couldn't give to the family he had chosen to leave behind. But the story didn't end with Thomas's disappearance. As the search entered its second week, a local rancher named Bob Kellerman was checking his fence line when he heard something unusual: the sound of horses in distress coming from a narrow canyon about 6 miles from Thomas's ranch. Following the sound, Bob discovered something that would bring the entire mystery full circle. Hidden in the canyon was a natural cave system that Thomas had been secretly preparing for months. Inside, Bob found shelter for the horses, stockpiles of feed, and medical supplies, and evidence that Thomas had been planning to disappear for some time. But most importantly, Bob found Thomas himself, very much alive but seriously injured from a fall. Thomas had been attempting to move his entire herd of rescued horses to this hidden location, planning to disappear completely and continue caring for them away from prying eyes. He had been terrified that his secret identity would be discovered and that authorities would separate him from the animals he had devoted his life to saving. The injury had left him trapped in the cave system for over a week, unable to call for help. When rescue teams finally reached Thomas, he was dehydrated and weak, but determined to protect his horses above all else. Even as paramedics treated his injuries, Thomas begged them not to separate him from the animals. He had spent years building trust with horses that had been abandoned or abused, and he couldn't bear the thought of them feeling abandoned again. The rescue operation took 3 days. Specialized teams had to carefully lead each horse out of the canyon and back to safer ground. Thomas was hospitalized for a week, but he insisted on daily updates about each animal's condition. Dr. Chen continued to provide medical care for the horses, working closely with Thomas even as legal authorities tried to sort out the complicated questions surrounding his identity. The media attention was intense once Thomas's story became public. News outlets across the country picked up the story of the soldier who had chosen to remain dead rather than disrupt his family's grieving process, who had spent 15 years quietly saving abandoned horses in the Montana wilderness. The opinion was divided. Some saw Thomas as a hero who had made an incredible sacrifice, while others criticized him for deceiving his family and living under false pretenses. The legal situation was equally complex. Thomas had not committed any serious crimes, but he had been living under false documentation for years. Military officials had to determine how to handle a soldier who had been declared dead but was very much alive. The Department of Veterans Affairs had to figure out how to manage benefits that had been paid to a person who was supposed to be deceased. But perhaps the most difficult challenge was personal. Thomas's former wife, Margaret, flew to Montana to see him. Their reunion was emotional and painful. She had spent 16 years believing he was dead, had remarried, had children with a new husband, and had built an entirely new life. Thomas had aged and changed, carrying the weight of his secret and the isolation of his choice. Margaret later told reporters that while she understood Thomas's reasoning, the reunion was one of the most difficult experiences of her life. She who had to tell her teenage children that their stepfather wasn't their biological father, that the man they thought was their father was actually alive and living in Montana. The family dynamics were shattered overnight. Thomas, for his part, struggled with tremendous guilt. He had made his choice believing it was the kindest option for everyone involved. But seeing the pain and confusion his reappearance caused made him question everything. In interviews with military counselors, Thomas repeatedly said that he felt like he had died in Afghanistan after all. The person he had been before his injury was gone forever, and the person he had become was shaped entirely by loss and isolation. The horses remained Thomas's primary concern throughout the legal and personal drama. He had invested everything financially, emotionally, and physically in their care. Many of the animals that had been near death when he purchased them were now healthy and thriving. The bond between Thomas and his horses was obvious to everyone who saw them together. The animals followed him around the property, naked when they heard his voice, and seemed genuinely distressed when he was away. A non-profit organization called Second Chances Ranch was eventually established to help Thomas continue his work legally and sustainably. Donations poured in from across the country as people were moved by his story. The organization purchased Thomas's ranch and hired him as the official caretaker, giving him a legitimate way to continue rescuing and rehabilitating horses while providing proper oversight and support. Dr. Chen became the nonprofit's chief veterinarian, and together she and Thomas developed protocols for horse rescue operations that would eventually be adopted by similar organizations across the Western United States. Their work caught the attention of veterinary schools, and Thomas began speaking at conferences about equine rehabilitation techniques he had developed through years of trial and error. The transformation in Thomas was gradual but noticeable. Having his work recognized and legitimized seemed to lift some of the weight he had carried for so many years. He began to open up to volunteers and visitors, sharing stories about individual horses and their recovery journeys. While he remained reserved about his personal past, Thomas became passionate about educating others about horse rescue and rehabilitation. 3 years after his disappearance and rescue, Thomas Mitchell, now legally using his real name again, had built Second Chances Ranch into one of the most respected horse rescue operations in the Mountain West. The ranch housed over 60 horses at any given time, most of them animals that had been considered beyond help when they arrived. The success rate for rehabilitation was remarkable, with more than 80% of the horses eventually being adopted into loving homes or finding work as therapy animals. But the story's most profound impact might have been on the people who heard it. Thomas's choice to remain dead rather than disrupt his family's grieving process sparked national conversations about sacrifice, love, and the different ways people cope with trauma. Military families especially connected with the story, recognizing the impossible choices that service members sometimes face when dealing with combat injuries and PTSD. Margaret eventually brought her children to visit the ranch. The meeting between Thomas and his biological daughter, now 18 years old, was awkward but meaningful. She later wrote about the experience for her college newspaper, describing the strange emotion of meeting a father she had never known existed, a man who had chosen to remain a ghost rather than complicate her life. The horses continued to be the bridge between Thomas and the world around him. Visitors to Second Chances Ranch consistently remarked on the obvious trust and affection between Thomas and his animals. He knew each horse's medical history, personality quirks, and preferred treats. More importantly, the horses knew him. They gathered around him when he entered the pasture, followed him on his daily walks, and seemed to understand that this quiet, patient man had saved their lives. On quiet mornings at the ranch, when Thomas walked among the horses as the sun rose over the Pryor Mountains, observers noted that he seemed at peace in a way that suggested his long journey through loss, sacrifice, and redemption had finally found its proper destination. The man who had once disappeared into the hills to protect his secret had found a way to live openly while still honoring the complex choices that shaped his path. The story of Thomas Mitchell and his horses became more than just a news event. It became a testament to the healing power of purpose, the complexity of love, and the possibility of finding redemption in the most unexpected places. In choosing to save horses that others had given up on, Thomas had somehow managed to save himself as well, discovering that sometimes the greatest act of love is learning how to live again today. 5 years after that fateful auction in Billings, Thomas Mitchell stands in the same pasture where he once hid with his rescued horses, but everything has changed. The man who once lived in shadows now works openly under the Montana sun, his story having touched hundreds of thousands of people across America. Second Chances Ranch has rescued over 300 horses, and Thomas has trained a new generation of volunteers in his rehabilitation techniques. The legal complexities of his situation were eventually resolved through a special military review board. Thomas received an honorable discharge and full recognition for his service, along with acknowledgement of the extraordinary circumstances that led to his presumed death. The Department of Veterans Affairs created new protocols for handling similar cases, recognizing that combat trauma can lead to decisions that seem impossible to understand from the outside. His relationship with his family evolved slowly and carefully. Margaret and her children visit the ranch twice a year, and while they will never have a traditional father-daughter relationship, Thomas's biological daughter Sarah has found meaning in helping with the ranch's social media presence, sharing the stories of rescued horses with a growing online community. She later said that understanding her father's choice helped her appreciate the different ways people show love and make sacrifices. Margaret remarried husband David eventually divorced, not because of Thomas's return, but because the revelation forced them to examine their own relationship more honestly. Margaret later said that learning Thomas was alive made her realize she had never fully grieved his supposed death, and that unresolved grief had affected every relationship she'd had since. She now works as a counselor for military families, helping others navigate the complex emotions that come with deployment and loss. Dr. Sarah Chen documented Thomas's rehabilitation techniques in a comprehensive study that was published in the Journal of Equine Veterinary Science. The methods he developed through intuition and desperation are now taught at veterinary schools across the country. She often tells her students that Thomas taught her that healing isn't just about medical intervention, it's about patience, consistency, and the profound connection between caregiver and patient. The ranch itself has become a pilgrimage site of sorts for people dealing with their own struggles with trauma, loss, and finding purpose after devastation. Thomas never set out to become a public speaker or inspiration, but visitors consistently report that spending time with him and the horses provides a unique perspective on resilience and recovery. He has a quiet way of showing people that it's possible to build something beautiful from the pieces of a broken life. The horses that started it all. Those 23 sick and abandoned animals from the 2019 auction lived out their days on the ranch. The last of them, an old mare named Hope, who had been nearly blind when Thomas bought her, passed away peacefully in 2023 at the age of 32. Thomas was with her at the end, just as he had been with dozens of other horses over the years, providing comfort and dignity in their final moments. On winter evenings, when the work is done and the horses are settled in their warm stalls, Thomas can often be found sitting on his porch, looking out over the Pryor Mountains where he once disappeared. Visitors sometimes ask him if he regrets the choices he made, if he wishes he had returned to his family immediately after his memory returned. Thomas always takes a long time to answer that question. He eventually tells them that regret is too simple a word for the complexity of his feelings. He mourns the years he lost with his daughter, the pain his disappearance caused his family, and the weight of carrying such a profound secret for so long. But he also knows that the person who emerged from that military hospital in Germany was not the same person who had left for Afghanistan, that Thomas Mitchell had died in the explosion, and the man who survived had to find his own way to live meaningfully. The horses gave him that meaning. In choosing to save animals that others had given up on, Thomas discovered that he could still be useful, still provide care and comfort, still make a difference in the world. The isolation that had seemed like punishment became the foundation for a different kind of purpose. The man who had been declared dead learned how to truly live. As Thomas approaches his 70th birthday, Second Chances Ranch continues to grow. A new generation of volunteers has taken over much of the daily work, but Thomas remains the heart of the operation. The horses still gather around him when he walks through the pastures, still nicker with recognition when they hear his voice. The bond he formed with those first sick animals has been replicated hundreds of times over, each rescue becoming part of a larger story about second chances and the possibility of redemption. The story of the lonely farmer who bought all the sick horses at auction and then disappeared into the hills has become legend in Montana and beyond. But for Thomas Mitchell, it's not a story at all, it's simply his life. Built one rescued horse at a time, one day of patient care after another, in the quiet spaces between heartbreak and healing where miracles happen not through dramatic gestures but through the steady accumulation of love, given freely to creatures who needed it most. In the end, Thomas Mitchell found what he had been searching for without knowing it, a way to honor both the man he had been and the man he had become, a purpose that justified the impossible choices he had made, and a peace that came not from forgetting the past but from building something worthy from its ruins. The horses had saved him just as surely as he had saved them, and together they created something that neither could have achieved alone, a testament to the power of love to transform even the most broken spirits into something beautiful and whole. Today, 5 years after that mysterious auction in Billings, Montana, Thomas Mitchell stands in the same mountain pasture where he once hid with his rescued horses, but everything has changed. The man who lived in shadows now works openly under the big sky, his extraordinary story having reached millions of people worldwide through documentaries, news features, and a best-selling book that he never wanted to write but felt obligated to share. Second Chances Ranch has rescued over 400 horses since that cold November morning when Thomas first bid on animals that everyone else had written off. The ranch now employs 12 full-time staff members and hosts over 200 volunteers annually. Thomas has personally trained dozens of people in his rehabilitation techniques, methods that seemed impossible when he first started but are now recognized by veterinary schools across North America. The legal maze surrounding his presumed death was finally resolved through a special congressional review that created new protocols for similar cases. Thomas received full military honors, back pay for his years of service, and official recognition that his choice to remain hidden was a result of combat trauma rather than any criminal intent. The Department of Veterans Affairs now has specific procedures for handling cases where service members suffer memory loss so severe that they become lost in the system. His relationship with his family evolved in ways none of them expected. Margaret never remarried after her second divorce, choosing instead to focus on a new career counseling military families through trauma and loss. She visits the ranch every summer with her younger children, who have grown up knowing Thomas as a distant but caring figure who sends them photos of baby horses and hand-carved wooden toys every Christmas. Sarah, his biological daughter, graduated from Colorado State University with a degree in veterinary medicine. Inspired by the stories she heard about her father's work, she now splits her time between a traditional practice in Denver and volunteer work at Second Chances Ranch, slowly building a relationship with the father she never knew existed. Their conversations are careful and sometimes awkward, but filled with a shared love for animals that bridges the years of separation, Dr. Chen documented Thomas's rehabilitation methods in a groundbreaking research study that revolutionized approaches to equine therapy nationwide. She often tells colleagues that Thomas taught her the most important lesson of her career, that healing happens not through dramatic interventions but through consistent patient care delivered with unwavering dedication. The techniques he developed, through trial and error, are now standard practice at rescue facilities across the western United States. The ranch has become something neither Thomas nor anyone else anticipated, a place of pilgrimage for people struggling with their own impossible choices and traumatic losses, veterans dealing with PTSD, families torn apart by addiction, individuals recovering from devastating accidents. They come to Montana not seeking answers but hoping to understand how someone can rebuild a meaningful life from complete devastation. Thomas never intended to become a symbol or inspiration. He still prefers the company of horses to people and grows uncomfortable when visitors treat him like some kind of saint. But he has learned to share his story because he recognizes that his experience offers something rare, proof that it's possible to find purpose and peace even after making choices that seem unforgivable. The original 23 horses from that 2019 auction lived out their remaining years on the ranch, each one teaching Thomas something different about resilience, trust, and the healing power of simple daily care. The last survivor, an ancient mare named Miracle, who had been hours from euthanasia when Thomas bought her, passed away peacefully in 2024 at the remarkable age of 34, surrounded by the man who had given her 6 extra years of life. On quiet evenings, Thomas can still be found walking among the horses as sunset paints the Pryor Mountains in shades of gold and purple. The animals gather around him instinctively, drawn by something in his presence that speaks to their own experiences of abandonment and recovery. Visitors often remark that watching Thomas with his horses is like witnessing a conversation conducted entirely through touch, breath, and an understanding that goes deeper than words. When people ask Thomas if he regrets the choices he made, staying hidden from his family, building a life based on a lie, disappearing into the mountains rather than facing the truth, he takes his time before answering. Regret, he says, is too simple a word for feelings this complex. He mourns the lost years with his daughter, the pain he caused people who loved him, the weight of secrets that nearly crushed him, but he also knows that the person who walked out of that German military hospital was not the same man who had deployed to Afghanistan. That Thomas Mitchell died in the explosion that took his memories. The person who survived had to learn how to build a life worth living from whatever pieces remained, and somehow, impossibly, he found a way to do exactly that. The horses saved him just as completely as he saved them. In choosing to rescue animals that others had abandoned, Thomas discovered that broken things can be made whole again, that love doesn't always look the way people expect it to, and that sometimes the greatest act of heroism is simply showing up every day to care for creatures who need you. As Thomas approaches 70, Second Chances Ranch continues to grow and evolve, but its heart remains the same, the quiet understanding between a man who lost everything and the animals who taught with him how to find it again. In the end, Thomas Mitchell's story isn't really about disappearing or secrets or even horses. It's about the miraculous possibility of second chances, and the truth that love, given freely and without expectation of return, has the power to heal even the most shattered lives. The lonely farmer who bought all the sick horses and vanished into the hills had found exactly what he was searching for, even though he never knew he was looking for it at all.